Today, you are going to hear the testimony of Ethan Cole, a renowned philosophy professor in Boston, the son of Muslim immigrants from Lebanon. He was the voice of cold reason and intellectual pride. He mocked Christian students, scoffed at the Bible, and said that faith is for the weak. But destiny placed him face to face with Charlie Kirk, in a debate that began with applause and ended in silence, the kind of silence that changes a life forever. That night, something happened in front of the cameras, something that neither logic nor philosophy could explain. Get ready, because the man who once mocked God is about to be confronted by God himself, and what begins as arrogance will end in a completely unexpected way. Before we begin, make sure you are already subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you deeply.
I remember perfectly who I used to be. I believed I had all the answers and that anyone who spoke about faith was weak. I grew up in a home where religion was more like a Cold War than a refuge. My father, a Lebanese man of Muslim faith, believed in discipline, rituals, and silence. My mother, an American free of any belief, valued autonomy and critical thinking. I grew up between the two, between the sound of the Quran on Sunday mornings and my mother's skeptical phrases over afternoon coffee. That's where I learned that faith was something to be questioned, never lived. From an early age, I understood that intelligence gave me power. In school, I challenged religion teachers with questions that hit where it hurt. Deep down, I didn't want answers. I wanted to prove they didn't have them. That was how I learned to feel in control. When I got to college, that feeling became an addiction. Logic, reason, argument, they were my shield. And when I realized people admired me for it, I made arrogance my flag. By the age of 38, I was the picture of intellectual success, a professor of modern philosophy at Boston University, author of 2 books on reason and freedom, invited to radio programs and international conferences. I was admired, quoted, respected, and completely empty. But that, of course, I didn't admit even to myself. In the classroom, I spoke as though I were laying down laws. My voice echoed through the hallways, and students looked at me as if I had discovered the secret of the universe. When one of them dared to quote the Bible, I smiled with that calculated disdain, and responded with phrases from Nietzsche, Sartre, or Foucault. The audience laughed. I laughed too. But inside me there was a silence that no applause could silence. To me, Jesus was only a symbol, a poetic invention of a society desperate for comfort. I used to say, faith is the excuse of those who lack the courage to think, and people applauded. That's what I wanted. Applause. It made me feel alive. But when night came and the auditorium was empty, I went home and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand why victory always came with a bitter taste. My marriage was falling apart, and I pretended not to see it. Communication with my wife had been reduced to exchanges of silence. She wanted love. I offered arguments. She searched for meaning. I gave cold answers. I prided myself on not believing in hell, but the truth is that I was already living in one. A hell of pride, loneliness, and doubt disguised as certainty. It was in that setting that something unexpected happened. A group of Christian students at the university organized a public debate. The theme, is Christian faith rational? I learned about the event through an email and, without thinking twice, accepted the invitation. I saw it as the perfect opportunity to ridicule faith and further strengthen my image as an unbeatable intellectual. The announcement spread quickly across campus. The atheist professor would debate none other than Charlie Kirk, one of the most influential names in contemporary Christian thought in the United States. It was going to be the perfect spectacle. I could already imagine the newspaper headlines, the applause, the viral videos on social media. I would become known as the man who defeated faith with pure logic. For days, I prepared like a warrior. I read theologians, Christian philosophers, religious scientists, not to learn but to find flaws. I wanted to dismantle every argument before it was even spoken. I felt like a judge ready to deliver the final sentence on belief. But in the days leading up to the debate, something began to happen. One of my students, David, a brilliant young man, always kind and respectful, was in a terrible car accident. He was taken to the hospital in critical condition. The news shook the campus. David was known for his strong faith and for the way he treated everyone with kindness. Even me, the professor who made jokes about the God he believed in. Driven by a sense of formality, I decided to visit him. When I arrived at the hospital, I found a group of students praying hand in hand in the hallway. I can't explain what I felt. That scene deeply disturbed me. It was as if something inside me had been struck. I stood there silently as they cried and prayed, and for a moment, I felt envy. Envy of the peace they had. I, the man who prided himself on having all the answers, stood there surrounded by young people who wept but seemed to possess a hope I had never known. I went home with a tight chest. That feeling wouldn't go away. That night, for the first time in many years, I cried, without knowing why. No apparent reason, no personal tragedy. Just a weight. A sadness I couldn't name. I sat on the floor of my office and stared at my books. All the volumes of philosophy that had accompanied me for years were there, neatly aligned on the shelf, like trophies of a man who believed he had conquered the world. And for the first time I asked myself, what if I'm wrong? The day of the debate arrived. The auditorium was packed. Cameras set up, reporters in the front row, students buzzing with excitement. I felt like I was at the center of the world. I wore my best suit, adjusted the microphone, and stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone about to win another battle. On the other side, Charlie Kirk waited calmly, with a Bible open on the table. His gaze was serene. No challenge, no fear. That disarmed me for a moment. I expected provocation, not tranquility. The moderator began the event and I was the first to speak. I started strong. I talked about evolutionary morality, about religion as a tool of domination, about the collective illusion of faith. Every argument I made landed like a blow. People laughed, applauded, agreed. I felt invincible. Charlie listened patiently. When it was his turn, I crossed my arms, ready to dismantle every word. But he didn't attack. He spoke about purpose, about repentance, about love. He told stories of transformation. And at one point he quoted the verse from Romans chapter 8, verse 31. If God is for us, who can be against us? The auditorium went silent. I can't explain what happened. I felt my heart race, my face burn. It was as if that sentence cut through the air and struck me in the chest. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The moderator looked at me, waiting for my reply, but the words simply vanished. I tried to think of Nietzsche, of Sartre, of Darwin, of any name that could save me from that vulnerability. But nothing came. The silence was heavy. I forced myself to smile, adjusted the microphone, and tried to hide behind irony. But something inside me had been struck. It was as if a crack had formed in the wall I had spent my entire life building. Then something even stranger happened. The stage lights began to flicker. The sound system failed. The audience murmured, and I tried to maintain control. And it was in that exact moment that I heard it. A voice. It wasn't external. It didn't come from the speakers. It was inside me, clear, calm, steady. Why do you persecute me, Ethan? I froze. I looked around, trying to hide my panic. Charlie remained calm, watching me. I wanted to believe it was nerves, exhaustion, my mind playing tricks. But it wasn't. That voice carried a weight, an authority, a tenderness impossible to ignore. The debate ended, and I barely noticed how. People came to congratulate me, shake my hand, praise my performance. But I was no longer there. I walked alone to the parking lot. The cold Boston wind cut against my face, and every step felt heavier. I stared at the ground, trying to understand what had just happened. When I got home, I went straight to my office. I closed the door, turned off the lights, and sat in silence. Charlie's words, the verse, the voice, everything echoed inside me. I looked at the bookshelf and saw something I didn't even remember owning. A Bible. A gift from a former Christian student I had humiliated years earlier. Back then I accepted it out of politeness. I had never opened it. I walked to the shelf and picked it up. My hands were trembling. I sat on the floor and stared at that book, trying to decide whether to open it or not. And then, something happened. I, the man who despised every form of faith, found myself on my knees, without understanding, without planning, just kneeling. The tears came without warning. I wasn't crying out of guilt or fear. It was as if the weight of my entire life had finally collapsed, and the silence that followed was the first sign of peace I had felt in years. There was no voice now, no heavenly light, no sound of angels, just a strange but real feeling, as if someone was there with me in the dark, a silent yet living presence. And in that moment I realized something was beginning, something I couldn't explain with logic or fight with philosophy. That night didn't end with answers. It ended with questions. But for the first time, I wanted to search for the answers in the right place, because deep down, I knew that voice hadn't been an illusion. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. 2 days after that debate, I still couldn't sleep. Charlie's words and that voice that had echoed inside me wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to convince myself that it had been a mental breakdown, a mix of stress and fatigue. But deep down, I knew it had been real. I just didn't want to admit it. So when the phone rang that cold morning, I answered without imagining I was about to witness something that would challenge everything I believed. It was the university secretary, her voice trembling. Professor Cole, the student David. He woke up. I froze. My fingers went weak, and the phone nearly slipped from my hand. I was speechless. The same David who had been in a deep coma, whom the doctor said had no chance, had simply woken up. No one could explain it. No new treatment, no scientific miracle. He just opened his eyes. In that instant, something inside me collapsed. I hung up the phone and stood still in the room, trying to process it. The rational man who always sought scientific explanations couldn't form a single argument. It was as if all my certainties had dissolved in seconds. I went to the hospital. But this time, not as the arrogant professor visiting out of politeness. I went as a broken man. The way there felt endless. Every step echoed like the sound of my own conscience. And when I arrived, I saw something I would never forget. David was sitting up, pale but awake, surrounded by tubes and monitors. On the small table beside the bed lay an open Bible. The room smelled faintly of alcohol and disinfectant, but there was something else there. A presence I couldn't explain. He saw me, and a weak smile appeared on his face. Professor, God heard our prayers. That sentence. It was like a knife cutting through my pride. I stood frozen, unable to respond. For years I had taught that prayers were human illusions, psychological mechanisms for comfort. And now, there he was, alive, smiling, saying that God had heard him. I felt tears start to form, but I fought them back. I tried to hide it, muttered something like, "I'm glad you're better," and left before he could see the chaos inside me. Outside, I sat on a bench by the hospital. The cold Boston wind cut across my face, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was David's words, the prayers of those students, and the voice I had heard on that stage. The man who denied miracles was standing before one. And the worst part, I couldn't deny it. I went back home without saying a word. I entered my office, closed the door, and sat on the floor, exhausted. My thoughts came like an avalanche. The debate, the voice, the miracle, David's gaze. In the middle of the confusion, my eyes fell on something on the shelf. That old Bible a student had given me years ago. A gift I had never opened, left there only as a curious object, gathering dust between the books of Nietzsche and Freud. I picked it up with trembling hands. The touch felt different now. Before, that book represented everything I despised, but that night it was as if it carried spiritual weight. I sat in front of it and just stared. The silence of the house seemed to breathe with me. For a long time, I simply looked at the worn cover, the yellowed corners. I was about to do something that, just a few days earlier, I would have considered weakness. But that dawn, without reasoning, without arrogance, without masks, I opened it. The first page that appeared was the Gospel of John, and the words seemed to leap from the page as if they were alive. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I read it again softly, like someone trying to understand a forgotten language. I felt a wave run through my body. It wasn't fear. It was something I had never experienced before, something between peace and repentance. I kept reading, and each verse seemed to speak to me, directly to me. Not as theory, not as philosophy, but as truth. I lost track of time. When I looked out the window, the sun was already beginning to rise. I had spent the entire night reading, crying, questioning, remembering everything I had said against God. With every page, it felt like he was dismantling one by one the fortresses I had built inside myself. And in the middle of that silent night of redemption, I said something I never imagined I would say. If you are real, Lord, do not run from me, because I no longer know how to run from you. And that's how it began. The miracle wasn't just David's awakening. The real miracle was the awakening within me. But contrary to what many believe, the birth of faith doesn't erase the past. It reveals it. And that's when the most painful part began. In the following days, something changed inside me. I could no longer enter the classroom with the same enthusiasm. The theories that once seemed brilliant now sounded hollow. When I tried to talk about morality without God, I felt a lump in my throat. When I heard students discussing the meaning of life, I wanted to say, "You're looking in the wrong place." I began skipping academic meetings. I declined invitations to speak. The dean called me in, concerned about my behavior. I made up excuses. I'm tired. I'm reviewing my materials. I'm preparing a new book. But the truth was that I no longer believed in what I was teaching. Some colleagues started whispering in the hallways. They said I was going through a midlife crisis. Others laughed, saying I had finally found religion. I pretended not to hear, but every word stung. The admired man, the brilliant intellectual, had become a joke. Then came the hardest blow. One night my wife looked at me with a cold expression and said, "I don't want to live with a fanatic." She packed her bags and left. No argument, no tears, just a silent goodbye. I watched the door close and realized that once again I was alone. I lost everything that until then had defined who I was. I lost the respect of my colleagues, my status, my invitations, the woman I loved. But strangely, in the middle of that destruction, something new began to bloom. There was a different kind of peace within the chaos. I woke up every morning with emptiness, yes, but an emptiness that no longer hurt. It simply waited to be filled. I began walking through the city with new eyes. Where I once saw only chaos, I now saw purpose. One day, I sat in a cafe and overheard two young women talking about prayer. Before, I would have laughed. But that morning, I stayed quiet, just listening. It was as if God was teaching me how to see again. But the inner battle was still real. The philosopher's mind that had always questioned everything tried to rationalize each step of faith. I caught myself debating with my own thoughts. Sometimes I said, "You're losing your mind, Ethan." Other times I answered out loud, "No, I'm finally waking up." I started walking to the neighborhood church in the late afternoons. I didn't go inside. I just stood on the sidewalk, watching people leave the service. Families laughing, embracing, eyes shining. I envied that peace. And at the same time, I felt that something in me was being shaped, as if God were watching me from afar, patiently. The following months were a journey. I lost publishing contracts, international invitations, even students who asked to transfer. Some newspapers printed cruel headlines. "Atheist professor suffers faith breakdown." I should have felt humiliated. But strangely, I felt relief. The truth is that faith didn't destroy me. It set me free. But that freedom came with pain. Because pride doesn't die easily. It resists, it screams, it tries to reclaim the throne. Sometimes I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the man reflected there. The once proud eyes were now calm. The once sharp voice now hesitated. And though loneliness surrounded me, there was something inside me that had never existed before. Hope. It was during this phase that I began to notice something different. When I opened the Bible at night, it was no longer just reading. It was a conversation. When I walked through the streets, every face seemed to carry a story. When I saw the same students who once mocked Christians, I saw myself in them. and silently prayed that God would do for them what he was doing for me. But don't think it was easy. There were days when I wanted to return to my old life, to the comfortable zone of pure reason. There were nights when I shouted at God saying I couldn't stand being ridiculed anymore. But every time something happened, a verse, a memory, a dream, it was as if the Holy Spirit whispered, "Keep going. I am not finished yet." And it was in the middle of that war between the old and the new that I realized, faith is not the end of doubt. It is the beginning of transformation. The Holy Spirit didn't free me with thunder, but with a silence that heals, shapes, and teaches. Today, when I look back on those days, I still feel the weight of what I lost. But even more strongly, I feel the presence of something I never want to lose again. The presence that entered my office that early morning and never left. I just didn't imagine that this transformation, still so recent, would be only the beginning, because the true test of my faith was still to come. A test that would challenge everything I had learned about forgiveness, love, and courage. Years passed, and the man who once mocked God now dedicated his life to teaching about him. The transformation in me was so deep that sometimes, when I looked in the mirror, I could barely recognize that face. I was still a professor, but the classrooms were no longer temples of arrogance. Now they were spaces of reflection, of purpose, of searching for truth. I had become a man who taught Christian philosophy, ironically in the same university where I once ridiculed those who believed in Jesus. But not every transformation is accepted by the world. My story began to spread. Some admired me, others rejected me. And in the middle of that mixture of recognition and resistance, I received an unexpected invitation, an interfaith conference on freedom of expression and faith in the modern century. When I read the list of speakers, my heart nearly stopped. Among them was the name of my father, the same man who had taught me since childhood that Christians were deceived, the same man who never accepted my conversion, who called me an apostate, a disgrace to the family. For a moment I thought of declining, but something inside me, a gentle and steady voice, said, "Go. It's time." During the week of the event, the city of New York was buzzing with journalists, students, and religious leaders. The auditorium was huge, modern, full of light. The sound of conversations echoed against the glass walls. I arrived early, sat in the last row, trying to prepare myself. It wasn't just a lecture. It was a reunion with the past, with everything I feared most. When they called my father's name, he walked onto the stage with the same authority he had always carried. He wore traditional Lebanese attire, his gaze firm and austere, his gray beard perfectly trimmed. He began speaking about freedom but soon shifted to faith. He quoted the Quran with passion, spoke of discipline and honor, and then he looked directly at me. Time stopped. "There are people," he said, "who have betrayed the faith of their fathers, who have bowed before foreign doctrines, people who have stained their family's name and traded truth for weakness." The audience went silent. I knew he was talking about me. Every word he spoke was an arrow, and I felt each one pierce my heart. Part of me wanted to stand up, respond with arguments, prove that I was right. The old voice of pride still whispered, "Defend yourself, Ethan. Show him he's wrong." But another voice, deeper, gentler, truer, and said to me, "Do not fight with words, fight with love." So when the silence became unbearable, I stood up. Every eye turned toward me. I walked to the center of the stage. My father stared at me coldly. I could see the disappointment in his eyes, and it was like reliving my childhood, when he would scold me for questioning his prayers. But that day, I was no longer the son seeking approval. I was the man who had been forgiven. Without saying a single word, I knelt down. The cameras captured the gesture. The audience held its breath. And there, in front of hundreds of people, rabbis, priests, Muslim leaders, professors, journalists, I began to pray. "Lord," I whispered, "bless my father. He taught me discipline, but you taught me love. He showed me the law, but you revealed to me grace. Touch his heart as you touched mine." Tears began to fall. I no longer cared what people would say. That moment wasn't about me. It was about reconciliation. It was about showing that the faith I once fought against was now transforming me from the inside out. The entire auditorium was silent. The sound of the cameras stopped. No one dared interrupt. When I finished, I stood up and embraced my father. For a moment, he was motionless, stiff, unresponsive. Then, slowly, his hands touched my back. And even though he said nothing, I felt that something had changed. In the following months, there was no contact. I kept teaching, and he returned to Lebanon. I thought that would be the final chapter of our story. But God was not finished yet. One night, I received a call from an international number. It was my sister, her voice breaking. "Ethan," she said, "Dad is sick. He asked to speak with you." I traveled the next day. The flight felt endless. When I arrived at the hospital in Beirut, I saw a different man. The same authoritarian father was now weak, with sunken eyes and pale skin. He was holding a small book in his hands. It wasn't the Quran, it was a Bible. He looked at me and with a faint voice said, "I want to know the God who changed you." Those words completely disarmed me. The man who had spent his entire life teaching me to despise Christians was now asking to know Jesus. I sat beside him and, with trembling hands, began to read the Gospel of John. The same words that had changed my life years earlier now flowed from my mouth to touch his heart. For God so loved the world. When I read that verse, he cried, and for the first time I saw him broken. I prayed with him. And there, in that hospital room, my father gave his life to Christ. When he passed away a few days later, there was no pain, only peace. I held his hand and realized that the same God who had rescued me was now receiving the man who had once called me a traitor. In that moment, I understood that the true purpose of faith is not only to change a life, it is to heal generations. After my father's death, I returned to the United States a different man. I knew that my mission was no longer to prove anything to the world, but to teach what I had lived. I began giving lectures about forgiveness, about grace, about how faith can cross cultural and religious boundaries. I spoke about the difference between religion and a relationship with God. And every time I told my father's story, people wept. The students who once listened to me talk about Nietzsche now asked me to explain the gospel. I realized that the environment where I had once spread doubt was now becoming fertile ground for faith. I started a Bible study group inside the university. In the beginning, it was only 3 students gathered in a small room. Today, there are dozens, and even professors attend. The sound of prayers echoes through the halls where I once mocked those who believed. Sometimes, as I watch, I remember who I was, the man who laughed at faith, and I shiver. Things began to change in ways I never imagined. A Christian channel invited me to record my testimony. The video went viral. Millions of people watched it. Messages began pouring in from around the world. Muslims, atheists, former professors, young people, who said they had rediscovered faith after hearing my story. I never sought fame, but God used even my past arrogance to reach people. He turned my rebellion into a tool of salvation. Today, when I walk into a classroom, I always begin with a short prayer. Some students find it strange, others close their eyes. I don't force anyone to believe. I simply testify. Philosophy is still part of my life, but now I see it as a bridge, not a wall. Reason took me to the edge. Faith helped me cross. And every time I look at the board and see young people hungry for answers, I think of myself. And I wonder, maybe someone here is about to hear the same voice that once called my name. I am still a professor, still studying, still questioning. But now I question to know the Creator better, not to deny Him. And every morning before the first class, I close my eyes and repeat the phrase that changed my life. I used to laugh at their faith. Now I pray with them. Those words remind me where I came from, what I lost, and how patient God has been with me. And each time I repeat them, I feel the same presence that once found me in the silence of my office. Alive, real, unchanging. It is the constant reminder that no mind is too proud, no heart too closed, and no story too far gone for God to transform. And that is why, even today, every time I walk through the university doors, I don't enter as a professor trying to teach. but as a saved man trying to testify, because in the end, teaching philosophy is good, but living the truth is better. And it was that truth, the same one that made me fall to my knees before an entire auditorium, the same one that broke the silence between a father and a son, the same one that helped me find purpose in pain, that now guides every step I take.
And so, the story of Ethan Cole reminds us that no one is ever too far to be reached by God. A man who once used reason to attack faith ended up discovering that true wisdom begins where pride ends. He lost everything the world valued, prestige, fame, respect, but found what no philosophy could ever offer, the living presence of Jesus. The same God who met him in the silence of his office may today be knocking at the door of your heart. If this story spoke to you, if it touched your spirit and reminded you of the transforming power of grace, I want to invite you to become part of this community. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and write here in the comments, "I love Jesus." That phrase is a declaration of faith and also a testimony to the world that the light still conquers the darkness. And get ready, because what comes next will deeply move you. The next video, which is appearing right now on your screen, tells the story of a radical woke feminist who despised Christians, until the day she debated with Charlie Kirk. What happened in that encounter will challenge everything you think you know about faith, redemption, and the power of truth. Click now, because every testimony is a new chance to witness the power of God in action. I'll see you there.